What if everything you thought you knew about why we are the way we are, from the mysteries of love and the allure of beauty right up to our very intelligence, what if it was all driven by something as fundamental and, well, often as perplexing as sex? Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of fascinating insights and really unpack them to get to the core of what truly matters. And today, you're in for quite an extraordinary journey into human nature.
Indeed. Our deep dive today is into Matt Ridley's acclaimed book, The Red Queen, Sex and the Evolution of Human Nature. And his central, I think, quite profound argument is this. To truly understand human nature, we have to understand how it evolved.
Okay.
And to grasp that evolution, we absolutely need to comprehend the evolution of human sexuality. It's sort of the key.
That's a huge claim. So we're talking about how reproduction acts as like the ultimate examination for all our genes, shaping almost every single thing about us. We'll discover why sex, even though it seems costly, is such a persistent enigma in the natural world. And for our own species, how this all led to this intellectual chess game that maybe produced our amazing minds.
Yeah, get ready to have some assumptions challenged. It's a fascinating ride.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's get right into the book's grand thesis. Ridley's core idea is that human nature and its evolutionary history, they're completely inseparable, right? You can't really understand one without the other.
That's the foundation.
But what's the central driving force, like the ultimate decider in this whole evolutionary story?
Well, it really all comes down to reproduction. Ridley makes a very compelling case that there's basically nothing in our natures that wasn't, at some fundamental level, chosen because it helped with reproductive success.
Okay, chosen.
Yeah, think of it like a really strict entrance exam for every single genetic trait. Any gene, doesn't matter how beneficial it might seem otherwise, if it leads to sterility, boom, it simply doesn't get passed on. End of the line for that gene.
So even if a creature is incredibly smart or super strong or lives a really long time, but it can't reproduce, all those amazing genes just vanish.
Poof, gone.
Like a brilliant student who aces every single test except the final exam and fails the course.
That's a perfect analogy, exactly. For genes, reproductive success is the final exam. It's the only thing that ultimately matters for getting into the next generation. If an animal's infertile, it's otherwise, superior genes are just lost. So this perspective, it forces us to view the very core of human nature through this lens of reproduction. Ridley argues you can't really understand most features of the human psyche without this fundamental reference point.
And this idea, it often bumps up against some really deeply held assumptions, doesn't it? Especially for people who argue human nature is just a product of culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Ridley tackles that head on. He doesn't dismiss culture, not at all. He offers a more nuanced view. Human nature is influenced by culture, sure. But culture, in turn, is also a product of human nature. And both are ultimately shaped by evolution. It's not all in our genes, he's careful about that, but our genes profoundly influence the, let's say, the framework of what our culture could possibly be.
He makes that point really clear with the chimpanzee comparison, doesn't he?
Yes, that contrast is really eye-opening.
Wow.
Chimps live in these, promiscuous societies.
Yeah.
Females mate with lots of partners, and males sometimes kill infants of females they don't know.
Which is brutal.
It is. And Ridley points out, quite starkly, that no human society even remotely resembles that pattern. Not one.
And that's critical. It shows human nature is distinct, right? It's not just infinitely changeable by culture alone.
Exactly. There's an underlying evolutionary framework. It sets boundaries, predispositions for what human societies tend to look like, and they look vastly different from chimp societies.
This idea of reproduction as the ultimate test, it really shifted how biologists looked at life, didn't it? It led to this kind of revolutionary perspective championed by people like Richard Dawkins. Almost flips our understanding of evolution upside down.
It certainly did. Dawkins, he essentially inverted the traditional view. Instead of thinking of bodies replicating themselves, the gene's eye view suggests that genes replicate themselves using bodies.
Yeah, okay.
So our bodies are essentially, evolutionary vehicles for our genes, temporary survival machines. If genes make bodies do things that help the genes get copied, like eating, surviving, having sex, raising kids, then those genes survive. Other kinds of genes just fade away.
So our bodies are these incredibly intricate machines fine-tuned over millions of years just to pass on our genes. Does that mean we're just biological robots? Or is there more to it?
Well, it means every living creature is a product of its past, right? Shaped by whatever successfully replicated before. So when a neo-Darwinian asks why we behave a certain way, they're really asking, How did this behavior evolve through natural selection to help genes get passed on?
Okay.
It's not about conscious choice in the moment necessarily, but about the long history, the contingencies, the adaptive purposes behind our instincts and drives.
But that leads to a fascinating paradox. If evolution is all about individual genes getting passed on, how can there be a universal human nature when every single one of us is unique? Ridley says all modern Homo sapiens share a common nature, descended from this small group in Africa maybe 100,000 years ago.
Yeah, he really emphasizes that. We are all one close family, fundamentally. We share the nature of that ancestral group. And to show how timeless human traits are, he points to Shakespeare.
Right, Shakespeare.
Think about it. Falstaff's boasting, Iago's cunning, Leontes' insane jealousy. These fundamental human motives, predicaments, personalities, they're instantly recognizable hundreds of years later. Our culture, our vocabulary might change, but the underlying nature, he argues, stays remarkably constant.
Okay, so the universality is consistent, but how does that fit with individual uniqueness? We are all so incredibly different.
And that's where sex comes in. It's the brilliant solution to that paradox. Sex constantly shuffles the genetic deck.
Okay.
It ensures that no child is an exact clone of either parent. This genetic mixing creates all the amazing individual differences we see around us. But at the same time, this constant reshuffling prevents any one family line from diverging too far off course. It keeps us all kind of within a golden mean, preserving a universal human nature across the whole species.
And this leads us to what he calls the bizarre consequences of sexual selection. This deep-seated drive we have to seek out good genes. Sounds like we inherited a very particular habit from our ancestors.
We certainly seem to have. We are descended from those who were successful at seeking out the best genes. And yeah, we've inherited that tendency.
So we're attracted to.
We're attracted to those with high reproductive and genetic potential, the healthy, the fit, the powerful. Sexual selection isn't just about basic survival. It actively sculpts forms and behaviors specifically for winning mates.
Like antlers or peacock tails.
Exactly. A stag's antlers are clearly designed for battle with other stags. A peacock's tail is designed for seduction. In the same way, Ridley suggests a man's psychology might be designed to take risks to acquire mates, because, historically, success in competition led to more, or maybe better, sexual opportunities.
And women's beauty.
Intimately linked to reproductive potential. It often reflects youth and health, which are indicators of fertility. Each sex, in essence, shapes the other through these evolved preferences over countless generations.
And here's where it gets really wild. Ridley introduces this frankly astonishing theory that human intellect itself, our big brains, our cleverness, might be a product of sexual selection, not just natural selection for survival.
Yeah, isn't that something?
Are you telling me our big brains might have originally evolved to outwit rivals or, well, to flirt and seduce?
That's precisely the theory he explores, and many evolutionary anthropologists now seriously consider it. Big brains might have helped men outwit other men, or women outwit other women in social competition.
Okay.
Or, perhaps even more intriguingly, these impressive mental skills, wit, creativity, language, were originally used primarily to court and seduce the opposite sex. It's a truly fascinating and maybe slightly humbling idea. Our profound intelligence as a kind of neurological peacock's tail.
Okay, so if sex is so fundamental to understanding human nature, why on earth has it also been called the queen of evolutionary problems by biologists? Ridley really drives this home with that brilliant thought experiment, the Martian's dilemma.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Imagine Zog the Martian studying humans, reporting back to the committee, and Big Zag just asks the simple question, why? Why sex?
It's a really humorous but deeply insightful way to frame the problem, isn't it? Zog's point is that even Earthling experts can't agree on why we have sex.
Right.
Some say it's just a historical accident we can't get rid of. Others say it's for fighting diseases or adapting faster or maybe repairing genes. Biologists who maybe once thought sex was logical almost overnight seem to realize it was incredibly hard to explain why it hadn't just disappeared. It genuinely baffled them for a long time.
And Ridley says to understand it, we have to enter this kind of looking glass world where common sense gets turned on its head. He writes things like, sex is not about reproduction, gender is not about males and females, courtship is not about persuasion.
For fashion is not about beauty, and love is not about affection.
Yeah, it's quite a provocative series of statements.
It really is. What does he mean by that? Well, I think he's suggesting that beneath the cliches, the obvious surface explanations, there's a deeper irony, a deeper evolutionary logic at play. What seems intuitive at first glance often turns out to be much more complex, driven by these underlying pressures that make things look counterintuitive when you dig deeper.
Okay, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, we should probably do a quick genetic glossary, just the absolute basics for everyone listening.
Good idea. So at its simplest, genes are like biochemical recipes, basically code written in DNA. They're organized on structures called chromosomes.
Right, chromosomes.
Humans typically have 23 pairs of chromosomes in each cell, carrying thousands of genes. Now, when we talk about sex in this evolutionary context, there are two really key processes. One is recombination.
Oh, okay, recombination.
That's where chunks of the paired chromosomes get swapped around when sperm or eggs are being formed. It shuffles the genetic deck within a lineage.
Got it. And the second?
The second is outcrossing, which is simply mating with another individual, combining your genes with someone else's.
So sex, as Ridley defines it biologically, is essentially recombination plus outcrossing. That's the core.
Precisely. That genetic mixing is its principal feature from an evolutionary standpoint. The result: an offspring with a really thorough mixture of genes from its 4 grandparents, thanks to recombination, and its 2 parents, thanks to outcrossing. Everything else we associate with sex, like gender, mate choice, love, jealousy, Ridley argues these are essentially ways to optimize those 2 fundamental processes.
Okay, that makes sense. But if sex has these benefits of mixing genes, why was it such a puzzle? What was this enormous cost of sex that had biologists scratching their heads for so long?
The twofold disadvantage. This is the big one. It's a massive evolutionary hurdle for sex to overcome. Imagine an asexual organism, like a self-cloning lizard or something, a parthenogenetic virgin, as they call it. It can potentially have twice as many offspring as a sexual pair. Why? Because it doesn't need to find a mate, waste energy on courtship, and, crucially, all of its offspring are female clones carrying all of its genes. Sexual females, on the other hand, only pass on half their genes to each offspring, and half their offspring are males who can't produce eggs themselves.
So sex is just incredibly inefficient from an individual's perspective.
Massively inefficient in the short term. Ridley uses that beautiful analogy of hummingbirds and flowers. Flowers produce costly nectar purely to bribe hummingbirds into carrying pollen for sexual reproduction. Nectar is a pure cost the plant pays for sex. If sex had no cost, he argues, hummingbirds wouldn't even exist.
Wow, that's a powerful way to illustrate the cost. And then you had people like Stephen Jay Gould suggesting sex might just be a spandrel, an evolutionary leftover like the human chin, maybe serving no real active purpose anymore.
Yeah, Gould argued that sometimes things in evolution are just there for accidental reasons, byproducts. Maybe sex was just a relic, hard to get rid of evolutionarily, but not actually doing much now. That idea really highlights the profound crisis of understanding that hit biology in the mid-1970s.
Right.
Biologists like George Williams and John Maynard Smith were openly admitting the cost of sex seemed insurmountable and that they were clearly missing something essential in their explanations.
So if sex is so costly and its benefits weren't immediately obvious, what were some of the theories people came up with to try and explain it? I recall hearing ideas about sex helping species adapt faster, or maybe combining good mutations.
Yeah, those were some of the early ideas. Theories often suggested sex helps a species adapt faster to changing environments, or that it combines rare beneficial mutations from different individuals more quickly than asexual reproduction could.
Which sounds plausible.
It sounds plausible, but they shared a common and ultimately flawed assumption: that evolution worked primarily for the good of the species. This was a huge logical trap. George Williams, back in the 1960s, brilliantly exposed the flaws in this group selection thinking. He showed that individual interests and the survival of selfish genes within individuals almost always win out in the evolutionary game.
So you don't evolve to help your species if it hurts your own chances of reproducing.
Pretty much no. An individual organism isn't going to adopt a costly strategy like sex just because it might benefit the species down the line. There has to be an immediate individual level advantage.
So the puzzle remained. Why would an individual organism choose such a costly path? What's the leading theory now? This is where the Red Queen hypothesis comes roaring in, right?
Precisely. This is the explanation that evolutionary biologists keep coming back to. It focuses on parasites as the prime movers in the evolution of sex.
Parasites. More important than predators.
In many ways, yes, from an evolutionary pressure standpoint. Parasites, viruses, bacteria, fungi, worms are arguably deadlier than predators for 2 key reasons. First, they are vastly more numerous. Second, and crucially, they have much, much shorter generation times than their hosts.
Meaning they can evolve much faster.
Exactly. They can adapt to their host's defenses incredibly quickly. This locks hosts and parasites into a relentless co-evolutionary arms race.
It's truly the world of the Red Queen, like in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where Alice has to run as fast as she can just to stay in the same place.
That's the perfect metaphor. Parasites provide this constant, intense, selective pressure for hosts to change their genetic defenses every single generation. It's a continuous battle of wits, like a chess game where every successful move is quickly countered, forcing you to constantly invent new strategies, new defenses. Without sex, a species is like a sitting duck, genetically speaking. It presents a static target, easy for rapidly evolving parasites to overcome.
And we even see this playing out in the digital world now with computer viruses.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? The emergence of computer viruses, these simple programs designed just to replicate and infect, it demonstrates that parasites are almost an inevitable consequence in any system involving life or information transfer. It really supports the idea that life itself is inherently vulnerable to parasites, solidifying their crucial role in driving these evolutionary arms races.
So how exactly does sex help fight these constantly evolving parasites? The book talks about maintaining a library of locks. What does that mean?
Okay, so sexual species maintain this diverse library of locks. That means they have many different versions of important genes, both across the population as a whole, that's polymorphism, and even within a single individual, carrying two different versions of many genes, that's heterozygosity.
So loss of genetic variety.
Tons of variety. This makes it incredibly difficult for any single parasite to find a universal key, a way to overcome the defenses of the entire host species. It's like having millions of different locks instead of just one master lock. Asexual populations, which are genetically uniform monocultures, are incredibly vulnerable. Think of a massive wheat field, all genetically identical. One successful pest or disease can wipe out the whole thing. Sexual populations are much harder targets.
Our own immune system is a bit like that too, isn't it?
It's a perfect example of the Red Queen in action. The immune system constantly generates new, essentially random locks antibodies to try and counter the parasite's ever-changing keys, their antigens. The way the AIDS virus, HIV, rapidly mutates and finds tiny chinks in the immune system's armor is a classic, tragic illustration of this relentless battle.
So the early theories about sex helping shed accumulated errors or combining good mutations, they weren't totally wrong, but maybe missed the main driver.
They captured parts of the picture, but they often struggled with the timescale or the individual advantage. For example, the idea that sex helps get rid of harmful mutations, called Muller's ratchet, is plausible. Asexual lines are like making photocopies of photocopies errors accumulate. Sex can, in theory, regenerate a clean copy. But the advantage is often too slow, too far in the future. An asexual rival, doubling its numbers every generation because of the twofold cost of sex, would likely outcompete the sexual lineage long before the mutation buildup becomes catastrophic. The Red Queen's parasite pressure provides a much more immediate generation-by-generation advantage for shuffling the genetic deck.
And then you have those baffling exceptions, like the bityloid rotifers, these tiny creatures that seem to have done just fine without sex for millions of years. How do they fit?
They are definitely an evolutionary scandal, as they've been called. Their existence really challenges the idea that sex is absolutely necessary for long-term survival. It highlights the complexity, the fact that there are often multiple solutions in evolution.
So how do they cope?
Well, they seem to have other extreme strategies. They can dry up completely, get blown around by the wind like dust, and rehydrate elsewhere. Maybe this dispersal helps them escape parasites. Or maybe they have incredibly robust DNA repair mechanisms we don't fully understand. They show just how creative evolution can be, but also perhaps how extreme strategies need to be if you abandon the Red Queen's primary defense sex.
But the most direct, compelling evidence for the Red Queen hypothesis came from Curtis Lively's snail study in New Zealand, right? That really seemed to seal the deal for many biologists.
It really did. Lively's work on these freshwater snails was brilliant because he could directly compare asexual and sexual populations living in the same lakes. He made specific predictions based on the different theories.
Okay.
The Red Queen predicts you'll find more males where there are more parasites because that's where the pressure to change defenses is highest. Other theories, like the tangled bank idea that sex helps diversify offspring for different niches, predicted more sex where the environment was more crowded or stable.
And what did he find?
He found exactly what the Red Queen predicted. More males, meaning more sexual reproduction, precisely where the males were most heavily infected with parasites. It wasn't correlated with environmental stability or crowding. It was a direct link between parasites and the prevalence of sex. It strongly suggested sex is primarily about keeping the parasites guessing, constantly presenting a moving target.
So Ridley and many others feel pretty confident that the Red Queen hypothesis is the front runner.
That's certainly his assertion in the book. He predicts that, looking back a century from now, biologists will conclude that the Red Queen hypothesis vanquished her rivals as the most powerful, most encompassing explanation for why sex persists despite its costs and why it's so fundamentally important in evolution.
Okay, we've explored the big evolutionary reasons for sex, mainly fighting parasites. Now, let's zoom right inside the organism itself, because Ridley says even there, it's not always peace and harmony. He starts chapter 4 with that witty Ogden Nash verse about the turtle concealing its sex.
I think it clever of the turtle in such a fix to be so fertile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sets a lighter tone before diving into some pretty serious genetic conflicts.
He introduces the concept of the tragedy of the commons, but applies it inside the body. How does that work?
It's a really insightful analogy. The classic tragedy of the commons is about shared resources, like a village pasture getting ruined because everyone acts in their own self-interest, overgrazing it until it collapses.
Right.
Ridley applies this to the collection of genes within a single body, the genome. While genes generally have to cooperate to build a functional organism, each individual gene is fundamentally selfish in the Dawkins sense. Its goal is to get itself into the next generation, sometimes even at the expense of other genes in the same body. This inevitably leads to internal conflicts.
So it's like Egbert Lee's Parliament of Genes idea. The genome isn't perfect democracy. It's more like an uneasy coalition, balancing cooperation with internal competition.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Lee pictured the genome as a society trying to balance individual free enterprise with collective harmony. Genes are descended from ancestors that were good at getting copied. So any gene that evolves a trick to enhance its own survival and transmission, even if it slightly harms the overall organism or other genes, can potentially spread. Cooperation is essential, obviously, to build the body in the first place, but competitive self-interest is also an inherent, unavoidable force within that genome.
And this internal competition can lead to the rise of what Ridley calls genetic rebels, or Cain genes, genes that actively sabotage their brethren.
Yes, in complex organisms, that cooperative harmony can break down, leading to these genetic mutinies. Ridley gives some really startling examples.
Like the Medea gene?
The Medea gene in female flower beetles is wild. It produces a poison and an antidote. The mother puts both in her eggs. Any offspring that doesn't inherit the Medea gene from her only gets the poison and dies. The ones that do inherit Medea also get the antidote and survive. It's literally a booby trap, ensuring only Medea carriers live.
Wow, that's ruthless. Any others?
Oh yeah, there are B chromosomes, entire extra chromosomes that are basically parasites within the genome. They don't carry essential genes. Their only function is to ensure their own transmission, often by sneakily invading more eggs than they should. And in some scale insects, it gets even more bizarre. Extra sperm in a fertilized egg can actually eat out the developing embryo's own gonads and replace them with tissue derived from the parasitic sperm.
Yeah.
It's like genetic cuckoldry at the cellular level.
That is absolutely incredible. So given these potential rebellions, how does the genome maintain order? How does it suppress these mutinies?
Well, one key mechanism is crossing over, the recombination process we talked about earlier, where chromosomes swap segments. Ridley colorfully describes crossing over as potential elephant repellent for selfish genes. Because crossing over shuffles genes around, it helps to break the linkage between a potentially selfish Cain gene and the essential well-behaved genes nearby on the chromosome. If a selfish gene relies on being passed along with crucial neighbors, recombination can separate them, making it harder for the selfish gene to spread without consequence.
But you mentioned sex chromosomes earlier. The X and Y don't cross over much with each other. Does that make them hotbeds for this kind of conflict?
Precisely. They are a major exception and particularly prone to these Cain genes. Because the main parts of the X and Y don't recombine, a selfish gene on, say, the Y chromosome can potentially act against the X chromosome without harming its own transmission, since it only gets passed to sons anyway.
Like what?
Imagine a gene on the Y chromosome that evolves to kill any sperm carrying an X chromosome produced by the same male. All surviving sperm carry the Y, ensuring all offspring are sons. This benefits the selfish Y gene enormously. It doubles its transmission rate.
But that would be disastrous for the species, right, if everyone only had sons?
Totally disastrous. It would drive the population towards extinction very quickly. It's a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons at the genetic level. What's good for the individual selfish gene is terrible for the collective, the species, or even the individual organism in the long run.
This internal conflict, this cellular bureaucracy problem, as Ridley calls it, leads us to perhaps the most fundamental division in biology, the invention of two genders. How does genetic conflict explain males and females?
This is a really profound insight, largely developed by Leda Cosmides and John Tooby. They argue that gender itself, the existence of two distinct types, male and female, is a solution to an even deeper, more ancient genetic rebellion.
Deeper than Y chromosomes killing X sperm.
Yeah, potentially involving the genes in our cellular organelles, like mitochondria. Remember, males are generally defined by producing small, mobile, numerous sperm, or pollen, in plants. Females produce few, large, immobile eggs. The key insight is that some genes reside outside the main nucleus, particularly in the mitochondria, the cell's powerhouses. And crucially, mitochondria and their genes are typically inherited only from the mother, through the egg cytoplasm.
Ah, so sperm don't usually contribute mitochondria.
Exactly. Now imagine if sex involved simply fusing two regular cells. Each cell would bring its own set of mitochondria with their own mitochondrial genes. What would happen? Cosmides and Tooby argue they could engage in a destructive cytoplasmic war, competing for dominance within the fused cell, potentially crippling the developing offspring.
So gender is a way to prevent this internal civil war between organelles from different parents.
That's the core idea. The solution that evolved was to have two mating types, or genders. One gender, which we call female, provides the large, well-stocked egg, complete with all the necessary cytoplasm and functional organelles. The other gender, the male, provides only its nuclear genes, essentially jettisoning its own potentially competing organelles.
So the male contribution is stripped down to prevent conflict?
Pretty much. Lawrence Hurst at Oxford calls this the organelle domestication theory. He predicts that wherever sex involves the fusion of whole cells, like egg and sperm, you'll tend to find two genders evolve to manage this potential conflict. But where sex is just gene transfer without cell fusion, like in some bacteria, there's no organelle conflict, and thus no need for distinct genders.
It's like safe sex tips for sperm. Leave your baggage at the door.
Exactly. Human sperm go to incredible lengths to achieve this. They strip off almost all their cytoplasm and organelles. They even jettison the mitochondria that power their swimming tail just before they enter the egg. Only the nucleus, containing the crucial paternal chromosomes, travels further into the egg.
Why such extreme measures? Just to prevent mitochondrial conflict.
Hurst suggests it might also be about disease. Fusing two cells could potentially reawaken dormant rival bacteria or viruses hiding in the cytoplasm of one parent or the other. By shedding almost everything, the sperm minimizes the risk of introducing not just rival organelles, but also rival infections into the precious egg. It's a multi-layered safety protocol.
Okay, this internal genetic conflict explains gender. Now, moving up a level, you mentioned the Travers-Willard hypothesis about parents potentially influencing the sex ratio of their offspring. How does that work?
Right. This theory, developed by Robert Travers and Dan Willard, suggests that parents, especially mothers, might unconsciously adjust the sex ratio of their offspring based on their own condition or social status, all in the service of maximizing grandchildren.
Maximizing grandchildren.
Yeah, think about it from the parent's genes perspective. In species where males compete intensely for mates, polygynous systems, a successful son can potentially sire far more offspring, and thus grandchildren, than a successful daughter ever could. He might win a large harem.
But a son could also fail completely, right? Get zero mates.
Exactly. A son is a high-risk, high-reward reproductive investment. A daughter, on the other hand, even if she's not the best, can usually find a mate and reproduce. She's a safer, more reliable bet.
So the prediction is?
The prediction is that parents in good condition, healthy, well-fed, high status, should gamble on producing sons, because those sons have a better chance of becoming dominant, high reproductive winners. Parents in poor condition, however, should play it safe and invest in daughters, who are more likely to reproduce at all, even if not spectacularly.
Has this been observed in animals?
Yes, there's supporting evidence from various studies, for example, on opossums, red deer, and hamsters. Mothers in better condition tended to produce more sons. It's not always clear-cut, and there are statistical debates, but the general principle seems to hold in many cases.
And what about applying this Travers-Willard logic to humans? It gets complicated with culture, surely.
It does, but the underlying logic might still apply. Consider societies that are female exogamous patriarchies, meaning females typically leave their home village or group to marry, while males stay and often inherit status or resources from their fathers. This is common in many human societies, historically, and even in apes. In such systems, Sons inherit status and wealth more reliably than daughters. Therefore, Travers Willard predicts that high-ranking wealthy parents should favor sons, who can leverage that status, while lower-ranking poorer parents might favor daughters, who might have a chance to marry up or are a safer bet.
Are there examples?
Laura Betzig's historical research provides some intriguing examples. She observed that in feudal Europe, lords tended to favor sons in inheritance, while peasants often left what little they had to daughters, perhaps because daughters had a better chance of marrying into a slightly better situation. Similarly, in the Indian caste system, there's evidence that high caste families historically sometimes practice female infanticide, favoring sons who maintain caste status, while lower caste families invested in daughters, perhaps hoping they could marry up, which was sometimes possible for women but not men. Dowries could even be seen as a distorted reflection of this parents investing resources in daughters to improve their marriage prospects.
But surely the overall population sex ratio stays balanced.
Ah, yes, that's the crucial insight from the great statistician R.A. Fisher. He showed that the population-wide sex ratio will almost inevitably hover around 1.1. Why? Because if one sex ever becomes significantly rarer than the other, it suddenly becomes advantageous for parents to produce offspring of that rarer sex, as they'll have more mating opportunities. This frequency-dependent selection always pushes the ratio back towards equilibrium. So, while individual families might skew their sex ratio based on Travers Willard logic, the overall population tends to balance out.
Okay, from genetic conflicts and sex ratios, let's move to something much more visible, maybe even frivolous seeming. Beauty. You quoted Aristotle Onassis earlier saying, if women didn't exist, all the money in the world would have no meaning. That really hints at this idea of female choice driving male effort, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And Ridley opens this chapter, The Peacock's Tail, beautifully with the example of the brush turkey. The male builds this enormous, meticulously maintained compost heap, not for shelter, not for food storage, but purely as a display.
Just showing off.
Just showing off for the females who wander around inspecting these mounds. They're incredibly choosy. They offer the male nothing but sex. They're solely seeking the best genes packaged in his sperm. This perfectly illustrates the fundamental difference we keep coming back to. Males often play the quantity game, females the quality game.
And the peacock's tail is the classic example. Ridley says it's basically the female's fault that males have these ridiculous, cumbersome tails.
Exactly. He puts it quite directly. Peahens evolved to be charmed, and peacocks evolved to do the charming. The tail isn't for survival. It's purely a result of female preference shaping male evolution over millennia. This chapter is all about exploring that Red Queen contest between male display and female choice that ultimately invented our concept of beauty.
This brings us squarely to Darwin's big idea of sexual selection, which he saw as distinct from natural selection for survival.
Right. Darwin realized that a huge amount of an animal's appearance and its behavior isn't just about surviving day to day. It's specifically about acquiring mates. Sometimes these traits even seem to hinder survival, like that peacock's tail making it easier for predators to catch.
He wrote a whole book about it, didn't he, after The Origin of Species?
He did. The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And since Darwin, experimental evidence has piled up confirming the power of female choice. Classic experiments like adding longer tail feathers to male widow birds or whitening the tail feathers of great snipe showed that males with artificially enhanced ornaments attracted significantly more females. The females were definitely paying attention.
So females choose, males evolve displays to meet those choices. Seems straightforward, but then we hit the like paradox, which apparently really stumped biologists for a while.
Yeah, the leak paradox was a big headache. Leks are these arenas where males of certain species, like sage grouse, gather just to display. They offer no resources, no territory, just themselves. Females come, watch the displays, and typically only mate with one or maybe a very small handful of the top-performing males.
Okay, so what's the paradox?
The paradox is this. If females are so consistently picky, generation after generation, always choosing the best males, the cream of the cream, as Ridley puts it, then shouldn't all the bad genes get eliminated pretty quickly?
Oh, right.
Eventually, all the males should become genetically very similar, all having good genes. If that happens, there's no genetic variation left to choose from. So why would females continue to be so choosy? What's the point of choice if all the options are basically the same? That was the conundrum.
So how did scientists start to unravel this? I know there were different ideas floating around, like mutational bias or these good gene theories.
Right, several ideas emerged. The mutational bias idea suggests that maybe those elaborate ornaments, like the peacock's tail, are inherently fragile, genetically speaking. They require lots of genes working perfectly together, so random mutations are more likely to mess them up and make the ornament less impressive.
Okay.
By choosing the male with the most elaborate, perfect ornament, the female isn't necessarily choosing some specific good gene, but rather the male with the fewest harmful mutations overall across his genome. This constant influx of new mutations ensures there's always some variation to select from it. Keeps turning some of the cream back into milk, as the saying goes.
And good gene theories.
These theories argue more directly that the ornaments are indicators of genuine genetic quality related to health and survival. Females choose males with bright colors or vigorous displays because those traits signal underlying good genes, perhaps for disease resistance, or foraging ability, which will then be passed on to her offspring, making them both attractive and more likely to survive. There's good evidence for this. Now, studies showing females choose mates whose offspring are indeed tougher or healthier.
So it's not just about looking sexy, it's about signaling real quality, which leads perfectly to Ahmad Zahavi's handicap principle. This one always struck me as brilliantly counterintuitive.
It is, but it makes so much sense once you grasp it. Zahavi's idea is that for a signal of quality to be honest, it has to be costly. The more a peacock's tail actually handicaps the male, making it harder for him to fly, escape predators, find food, the more reliable a signal it is of his underlying genetic superiority.
Pressa.
Because only a genuinely high-quality male with really good genes for survival and vigor could possibly afford to grow and maintain such a costly, cumbersome ornament and still survive. Surviving, despite the handicap, is the proof of quality. A low-quality male trying to fake it would likely perish.
So the cost guarantees the honesty of the signal.
Exactly. It took a while, but mathematical models eventually showed Zahavi was right. Costly handicaps can indeed evolve as reliable indicators of quality.
And this is where the Red Queen comes galloping back in to provide perhaps the neatest solution to the leak paradox itself through Hamilton and Zooke's parasite theory.
Yes, Bill Hamilton and Marlene Zooke tied it all together beautifully, they argued. If the main evolutionary pressure driving the need for genetic diversity, and thus sex, is the constant battle with parasites, then what females should be selecting for in males is resistance to current parasites. And because parasites are evolving so rapidly, remember the Red Queen race, the specific genes that confer resistance this generation might be useless or even harmful next generation when the parasites adapt.
Yeah.
So by choosing the male who looks healthiest right now, the one with the brightest colors, the most vigorous display, the fewest signs of disease, the female is effectively choosing genes that are good at fighting this generation's parasites.
And next generation, the parasites will have changed, so the best genes might be different.
Precisely. This means female preference will constantly shift, favoring different genetic combinations over time as the parasite landscape changes. This process continuously maintains genetic diversity in the male population, solving the leak paradox. There will always be genetic variation worth choosing from because the definition of good genes is always changing, thanks to the parasites.
That's elegant. And it links back to the idea of communication as manipulation, which Dawkins and Krebs highlighted. It's not just information, it's persuasion.
Absolutely. They argued that animal communication, whether it's a bird song, a frog's croak, or maybe even human advertising, isn't just about neutrally transferring information. It's primarily about persuading the receiver to act in the sender's interest.
Like a sales pitch.
Exactly like a sales pitch. The male bird isn't just saying, "I am healthy." He's singing a song designed to convince the female he's the best choice. A human advertiser doesn't just list product specs. They use alluring images and emotional appeals. A man might send expensive gifts to signal wealth rather than just showing his bank statement. It's about packaging the signal seductively.
And this leads to specific biological signals like carotenoids and testosterone being honest signals of health because they are intrinsically linked to the body's condition.
Right. Carotenoids are those red, orange, and yellow pigments that many birds and fish get from their diet. They're essential for immune function. If an animal is sick with parasites, it struggles to absorb or utilize these pigments effectively. So the brightness of a bird's plumage or a fish's scales becomes a direct, visible, and honest indicator of its current parasite load and overall health.
And testosterone.
Testosterone is fascinating. It's the elixir of masculinity, driving the development of many males' secondary sexual characteristics, bigger muscles, antlers, brighter colors, deeper voices, more aggressive behavior. But here's the catch. High levels of testosterone also tend to suppress the immune system.
So it's a trade-off.
It's a built-in handicap. It creates an honest signal. Only a truly robust, genetically superior male can afford to maintain high testosterone levels develop impressive masculine traits, and still fight off diseases effectively. As Ridley puts it, males are thus necessarily more vulnerable to disease as they acquire the accoutrements of maleness. Females can read these signals like the number of breeding tubercles on a male roachfish, which directly reflects his parasite load to assess not just overall health, but perhaps even resistance to specific types of parasites.
But signals aren't always honest, are they? Can there be dishonest signaling or exploitation by the receiver?
Yes, the evolutionary arms race includes deception and exploitation too. There's the idea of sensory bias, developed by researchers like Mike Ryan and Mark Kirkpatrick. This suggests that females might sometimes have pre-existing biases in their sensory systems, perhaps originally evolved for finding food or avoiding predators that males can then evolve to exploit for courtship.
Like the Tungara frogs.
Exactly. Male Tungara frogs add a chuck sound to their calls to make them more attractive to females. But Ryan showed that the female's preference for this chuck sound likely existed before the males evolved to make it tapped into a pre-existing auditory preference. Similarly, female platyfish prefer males with artificial swords attached to their tails, even though sword tails don't exist in their own species lineage, suggesting an ancestral bias.
So males can sometimes just tap into what females already like for other reasons?
Potentially, yes. It adds another layer to the complexity of sexual selection. It's not always about handicaps or direct indicators of health. Sometimes it might just be about pushing the right sensory buttons. Andrew Poniatkowski and others have tried to synthesize all these ideas, suggesting that sexual selection involves a complex interplay of mutation pressure, sensory biases, the Fisherian runaway effect where arbitrary traits get exaggerated, and condition-reflecting traits driven by the Red Queen's parasite pressure. It's a rich and dynamic field.
Okay, from the elaborate dance of beauty and signaling, let's now dive into Chapter 6, Polygamy and the Nature of Men. Ridley kicks this off with a really stark historical example, the Inca Empire's reproductive economy. It sounds almost unbelievable.
It really does paint a picture of male reproductive strategies taken to an absolute extreme. You had the Inca Sun King, Atahualpa, with literally thousands of chosen women or concubines.
Thousands.
Thousands. And then other ranks of nobles and officials had legally prescribed numbers of wives or concubines, scaling down according to rank. It was a highly stratified system where male reproductive access was directly tied to power and status.
And what about the average man in this system?
Well, the consequence of this extreme polygyny at the top was inevitably enforced celibacy or delayed marriage for many men at the bottom. And the penalties for any man caught having an affair with a superior's wife, or even one of the sun virgins, were incredibly severe, often death.
It really highlights that link between power, status, and male reproductive success that Ridley keeps coming back to. And it pushes back against the idea that human behavior is just culture.
Absolutely. Ridley uses examples like this to argue against the view, long dominant in social sciences, that attributed almost everything uniquely human solely to culture, resisting evolutionary explanations for behavior. He argues that many human universals, things like complex grammatical language, social hierarchy, romantic love, intense sexual jealousy, the tendency towards long-term pair bonds, these aren't just arbitrary cultural inventions. He sees them as trainable instincts, deeply rooted patterns shaped by our evolutionary past, just like our physical traits.
So from this evolutionary male perspective, what's the point of marriage or pair bonding?
Well, putting it quite starkly from a purely genetic viewpoint, Ridley frames it as exploitation. For men, women are potential vehicles for their genes. For women, men are sources of sperm and potentially resources. Each sex, in this view, seeks to exploit the other for its own reproductive ends.
That sounds a bit cold.
It's the cold logic of gene's-eye view evolution. Robert Triver's parental investment theory is absolutely key here. The theory states that the sex that invests more in producing and raising offspring, typically females and mammals, due to pregnancy and lactation, has less to gain from seeking additional mates. Their reproductive output is limited by the time and energy required for each offspring, so they prioritize mate quality.
And the sex that invests less?
The sex that invests less, typically males, whose minimum investment can be just sperm, has potentially much more to gain reproductively from mating with multiple partners. Their reproductive output is limited primarily by the number of females they can inseminate, so they tend to prioritize mate quantity.
The classic peacock versus peahen example again. He contributes sperm, she does all the work raising the chicks.
Exactly. He benefits from mating with as many peahens as possible. She benefits from choosing the peacock with the best genes. This fundamental asymmetry in parental investment Shriver's argued,
Mm.
is the ultimate driver of many sex differences in mating strategies and behavior across the animal kingdom, including potentially humans.
And this difference in strategy potentially explains patterns we see in human behavior, like the persistent demand for female prostitution, or the historically high rates of promiscuity among male homosexuals compared to heterosexuals or lesbians.
That's the inference Ridley draws. The demand for prostitution, he suggests, reflects an underlying male appetite for sexual variety that isn't solely tied to reproduction or pair bonding. Similarly, studies conducted before the AIDS epidemic, particularly by the Kinsey Institute and in places like San Francisco bathhouses, indicated that male homosexuals, free from the constraints of female choice or the need for paternal investment, often engaged in far more promiscuous behavior than other groups, sometimes having hundreds or even thousands of partners. Ridley interprets this as revealing a baseline male drive for multiple partners when certain social or biological constraints are removed.
So, in this chess game of sex, where individuals and sexes have conflicting interests, how do different mating systems, like monogamy versus polygamy, actually arise?
It often comes down to ecological factors and game theory, as John Maynard Smith showed. Different mating systems can be seen as evolutionarily stable strategies, systems where the best strategy for an individual depends on what everyone else is doing.
Okay.
For instance, the polygyny threshold model tries to explain why females in some species or some human societies might actually choose to become the second or third wife of an already married wealthy male, rather than the sole wife of a poorer male.
Why would they do that?
The model suggests it's a rational economic choice from the female's perspective. If the wealthy male controls so many resources, like land or cattle, that even a share of those resources provides more for her and her offspring than all the resources of the poor male, then joining the harem might be the better reproductive strategy for her, even if she has to share the male's attention and paternal care. The Kipsigis people of Kenya are often cited as an example. Men with more land and cattle historically had more wives, and women seem to willingly enter into polygynous marriages with richer men.
Though presumably the first wife isn't always thrilled about this arrangement.
No, Ridley acknowledges the potential for conflict there, citing examples from Mormon history. It raises interesting questions, like who actually benefits most from laws enforcing monogamy? Is it women? Or, perhaps counterintuitively, is it lower status men, who might otherwise face a shortage of potential wives if high status men monopolize them?
So environmental factors are huge, but history and ancestry play a role too.
Definitely. Ridley contrasts red grouse, which are monogamous, with black grouse, which gather in leks for polygamous mating, even though they live in similar moorland habitats. This suggests their different evolutionary histories, perhaps ancestry from different types of forest dwellers, shaped their current mating systems, not just the immediate environment.
And for humans, the shift to eating more meat way back with Homo erectus was a major turning point.
Seems likely. Around 1.6 million years ago, the shift towards a diet richer in meat probably led to wider ranging, more cooperation, especially in hunting, and perhaps necessitated longer periods of juvenile development and learning. This forms part of what anthropologist Don Simons called the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or EEA.
The EEA. That's the idea that our psychology is adapted to our ancestral past.
Right. Simons argued that human psychology isn't necessarily adapted to modern industrial society, but to the conditions under which we spent the vast majority of our evolutionary history, probably as small, nomadic, or semi-nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. He suggests this ancestral environment shaped fundamental aspects of human nature. Things like the tendency toward pair bonding, romantic love, sexual jealousy, men's concern with status, women's preference for youth and resources in mates, intergroup conflict, warfare, and a sexual division of labor.
And when agriculture came along, allowing wealth to be stored and accumulated, that's when polygamy really took off in human societies.
That seems to be the pattern. Hunter-gatherer societies tend to be only mildly polygynous, partly because luck plays a big role in hunting success, and wealth, like meat, is hard to store and often shared reciprocally. This limits the ability of any one man to consistently control vastly more resources than others.
But farming changed that.
Agriculture changed the game. It allowed for the accumulation of surplus food, land, livestock, durable forms of wealth. This led to greater inequalities, allowing some men to gain significantly more power and resources, which in turn allowed them to support, attract, or acquire more wives. Simple agricultural societies often saw chiefs or wealthy men with harems of up to 100 women. Pastoral societies, based on herding animals, were almost always polygamous, likely due to the economies of scale involved in managing large herds, which further amplified wealth inequalities.
And then in large empires.
In the great empires of history, Babylon, Egypt, the Incas, China, the rulers at the very top had access to staggering numbers of women, sometimes thousands, in their harems and courts. This reflects power as the ultimate means to command resources, allies, and consequently reproductive opportunities. This link between power-seeking and sexual rewards is common in social mammals, like Cape buffalo or chimpanzees. In humans, power comes not just from brute strength, but from cunning, political skill, wealth accumulation, and alliance formation.
This Darwinian history perspective, looking at historical patterns through an evolutionary lens, reveals some quite uncomfortable patterns, like the treatment of women in stratified societies.
Yes, anthropologist Mildred Dickman did pioneering work applying Darwinian ideas to human history. She found that in highly stratified societies, like those in historical India or the Middle East, people generally behaved in ways that seemed designed to maximize their descendants according to evolutionary logic. For high-status men, this meant polygyny. For women, it meant trying to marry up in status. Customs like large dowries, parental investment in daughters' marriage prospects, female infanticide, sometimes practiced by high-status families to concentrate resources on sons, and the intense guarding or claustration of women to ensure paternity certainty and protect family honor status, all seem to fit this evolutionary interpretation of maximizing reproductive success within a hierarchical system.
Even warfare. Ridley argues its roots might lie more in competition for women than for resources like food or territory.
That's a controversial but compelling argument he presents. He points to chimpanzee intergroup violence, where male patrols actively raid neighboring territories and will kill rival males and often seize females from the defeated group. Territory seems to be a means to the end of accessing females.
And the Yanomama study.
Napoleon Changnan's famous long-term study of the Yanomamo people in the Amazon documented that their chronic warfare seemed to be explicitly fought over women, not just scarce resources like game or garden land. Men who were successful warriors, known as unokais, those who had killed, demonstrably had more wives and thus higher reproductive success. Changnan's provocative question sums it up. Why bother to fight for mango nuts when the only point of having mango nuts is so that you can have women? Why not fight over women directly?
It challenges the standard economic or resource-based explanations for warfare. But then, given this long history of polygyny linked to power and wealth, how did Western societies end up predominantly enforcing monogamy? It seems like an anomaly.
It is enigmatic, and Ridley notes that neither the rise of Christianity nor early feminist ideas fully explain the relatively abrupt outlawing of polygamy in the West compared to most other complex societies throughout history.
So what's the theory?
One hypothesis he discusses is a kind of democratic theory. As European societies evolved away from absolute despotism, kings and rulers needed the support of broader alliances, including lower-ranking nobles and eventually commoners. This shift in power dynamics meant that the interests of the majority of men who would likely be monogamous or celibate under widespread polygyny gained more influence. When these monogamous men gained a political voice, they effectively voted against the interests of the polygynous elite, leading to laws enforcing monogamy, which distributed reproductive opportunities more evenly among men.
Interesting. So monogamy laws might have benefited average men more than women initially.
That's one interpretation. However, Ridley also emphasizes that despite the prevalence of despotic and polygamous systems throughout much of human history, the underlying tendency towards forming strong, long-term pair bonds, the basis of monogamous marriage, seems to have survived as a core human institution.
So wrapping up this male perspective, even in our modern world, Ridley suggests the modern hunter-gatherer mind is still operating with these ancient rules.
Pretty much. He suggests that deep down, the modern man's mind might still hold a kind of hunter-gatherer rule. Strive to acquire power, status, and resources, because historically, these were the means to attract mates and achieve genetic eternity.
And women.
Similarly, he proposes that women's minds might still operate with a complementary hunter-gatherer calculator, seek a reliable investing partner, a provider husband, but potentially also seek out genetically superior partners for clandestine affairs, a lover for first-class James. The modern stereotype of the rich tycoon's wife bearing a baby that grows up to resemble her beefy bodyguard is presented as a potential, albeit anecdotal, manifestation of this enduring dual strategy.
Okay, after exploring male strategies, particularly the drive towards polygamy, let's flip the coin and look at Chapter 7, Monogamy and the Nature of Women. And Ridley immediately confronts us with the paradox of female adultery, starting with some really startling statistics from Western Europe.
They're quite arresting, aren't they? Studies he cites indicate surprisingly high rates of adultery. And the patterns are interesting. Women involved in affairs often choose partners who are dominant, older, more physically attractive, and frequently married themselves.
And attractive men might be less attentive fathers.
That's another finding he mentions. It sets up this potential conflict for women between securing good genes and securing reliable paternal investment. And the most striking statistic, estimates suggesting that perhaps up to 1 in 3 babies born in some Western populations might be the result of an adulterous affair.
1 in 3, that's huge. How does this fit into the evolutionary picture? Why would females, who typically invest more in offspring, engage in risky infidelity?
Well, going back to primates, the risk of infanticide by incoming or rival males often gave females a strong incentive for loyalty to a particular male or group, and for males to protect offspring they believed were theirs. Humans, however, are unusual. Ridley calls us bastard birds in a way.
Why bastard birds?
Because, like many socially monogamous bird species that live in colonies, humans seem to have reinvented monogamy and paternal care, while still living in large groups with many potential partners around. This is a paradox compared to our closest ape relatives, gorillas, chimps, orangutans. This unique social setup opens the door for female infidelity to serve a strategic purpose beyond just escaping an unhappy primary relationship.
So it's not just the Dallas scenario of seeking emotional fulfillment elsewhere, but maybe an Emma Bovary strategy.
Exactly. Ridley suggests it could be a sexual plan B, a strategy, perhaps often unconscious, for women to obtain potentially superior genes from an affair partner, the lover, while still retaining the security, resources, and paternal investment from her long-term partner, the provider husband.
And this idea finds support in some surprising anatomical clues, like Roger Short's work comparing testicle sizes across primates.
Yes, Short's observations were groundbreaking. He noticed the stark contrast. Chimpanzees, who live in highly promiscuous groups where females mate with many males, have enormous testicles relative to their body size. Gorillas, who live in harems where one male typically monopolizes several females, less sperm competition, have tiny testicles despite being much larger animals overall.
So bigger testes equals more sperm competition.
That was Short's conclusion, and it holds up well across many species. In systems where multiple males are likely to mate with the same female around the time of conception, there's intense sperm competition after mating inside the female's reproductive tract. Males who produce larger volumes of sperm, or faster swimming sperm, have a better chance of fertilizing the egg. Hence, evolution favors larger tests in species with female promiscuity. Humans fall somewhere in the middle, suggesting a history of mild polygyny and perhaps significant female infidelity, leading to moderate levels of sperm competition.
And this leads to the idea of an unconscious game of paternity being played out, even down to the level of orgasm timing. Baker and Bellis's research here sounds fascinating, if controversial.
It was certainly attention-grabbing research. Robin Baker and Mark Billis claimed their studies showed that the timing and intensity of women's orgasm could influence sperm retention, how much sperm is kept versus ejected after intercourse.
And the implication for infidelity?
They argued that their data suggested unfaithful women tended to have orgasms that retained more sperm when mating with their affair partners, especially in timed around their peak fertile period. They interpreted this as a potential unconscious physiological mechanism, allowing women to bias paternity towards a genetically preferred lover, even while maintaining a relationship with a husband.
Like women being one evolutionary step ahead in this arms race.
That was their interpretation. They also suggested men have counter strategies, like unconsciously adjusting the number of sperm ejaculated based on how long they've been separated from their partner. More separation equals potentially higher risk of infidelity, so more sperm. It paints a picture of this ongoing, often unconscious, evolutionary tug-of-war between the sexes over paternity.
Which brings us to another major puzzle: concealed ovulation in human females. Unlike most other primates, human females don't have obvious external signs when they are fertile. Why is our fertility hidden?
It is a genuine evolutionary enigma, this reproductive inscrutability, as Ridley calls it. There are two main competing hypotheses.
Okay, what are they?
The first is the paternal investment, or daddy-at-home hypothesis. This suggests concealed ovulation evolved to keep males around. If a male doesn't know exactly when his partner is fertile, he has to stick around and meet with her regularly throughout her cycle to have a good chance of fathering her offspring. This promotes pair bonding and ensures his continued presence for potential paternal care.
Makes sense. What's the alternative?
The second hypothesis links concealed ovulation more to female choice and, potentially, the adultery strategy we just discussed. Hiding ovulation might allow females to be more discriminating in their mate choices, without constantly attracting unwanted attention or aggression from multiple males when they are fertile. It could also be seen as a crucial weapon in the adultery game.
That's so.
By concealing her fertile period, a woman can potentially mate stealthily with a preferred affair partner without alerting her primary partner, thus securing those good genes on the side while maintaining the main relationship. This view highlights that female strategies aren't necessarily about solidarity with other women. There can be intense competition between women, for example, wife versus mistress.
This whole pattern, social monogamy, but with significant infidelity, mate guarding, and privacy around sex, sounds very much like those sparrow fights Ridley describes in Colonial Birds.
The parallels are striking. Species like pied flycatchers or house sparrows are predominantly monogamous, with males helping raise the young. But genetic studies revealed extremely high rates of extra-pair paternity chicks being fathered by neighboring males.
So lots of cheating going on.
Lots of cheating. Males in these species often try to achieve bigamy, having two nests, but it usually comes at a cost to both the primary wife and the secondary mistress, as the male can't provide adequate parental care to both broods. They'd often do better reproductively if they had an exclusively devoted male partner. Humans living in large social groups, colonies, being mostly monogamous but with common adultery, intense male mate guarding, male violence towards suspected lovers, and frequent population within the pair bond, partly to ensure paternity, fit this socially monogamous but genetically messy bird model surprisingly well. Ridley suggests our intense desire for sexual privacy is largely driven by this cuckoldry paranoia.
And speaking of cuckoldry paranoia, that inevitably leads us to the green-eyed monster, male sexual jealousy. Ridley argues this isn't just a modern pathology, but a deep-seated, universal human trait.
Yes, drawing heavily on the work of Margot Wilson and Martin Daly. Ridley emphasizes that intense male sexual jealousy appears to be a human universal, found across cultures, not just a product of specific social conditions or individual neurosis.
And evolutionarily, why is it so strong in males?
From an evolutionary perspective, the potential costs of being cuckolded are much higher for a male than the costs of infidelity are for a female, in terms of gene transmission. A female always knows her offspring are hers. A male faces paternity uncertainty. Investing years of resources in raising another man's child is a huge potential reproductive loss from his gene's perspective. Therefore, strong selective pressure likely favored the evolution of intense male jealousy as a mechanism to guard against cuckoldry.
Wilson and Daly found it's often framed as a property violation.
Yes, infidelity by a wife is frequently perceived by the husband across many cultures as a violation of his rights or property, often leading to rage and violence, the Othello syndrome. Tragically, spouse homicide is often rooted in male sexual jealousy, and historically, legal systems often treated killings driven by jealousy more leniently, sometimes viewing them as understandable reactions of a reasonable man who discovered his wife's infidelity.
That evolutionary perspective even sheds light on why jealousy might be linked to low self-esteem, doesn't it?
It does. Conventional wisdom might say jealousy causes low self-esteem, but Wilson and Daly flip it. Perhaps men with lower status or fewer resources, and thus maybe unconsciously lower self-esteem regarding their mate retention ability, are objectively more likely to be cuckolded. In that case, jealousy might be an evolved psychological mechanism that's particularly sensitive in men who perceive themselves as being at higher risk of losing their mate.
Okay, so wrapping up the female perspective. Despite all the complexities of modern life, contraception, etc., Ridley argues the underlying evolutionary drives persist. Wealth and status still matter for male reproductive success, and female strategies continue to navigate the trade-offs between securing resources and securing good genes.
That's the core argument. While modern society is vastly different from the EEA, he suggests these deep-seated drives haven't just vanished. Men still strive for status and resources, which historically translated into reproductive success and often still correlate with it, even if indirectly. And women, he argues, continue to employ complex strategies, consciously or unconsciously, balancing the need for a reliable investing partner with the potential benefits of seeking superior genetic quality, sometimes leading to the hunter-gatherer calculator, favoring that dual strategy of provider-husband and good genes lover.
All right, this next chapter, Sexing the Mind, the Origins of Mental Differences, ventures into potentially very sensitive territory. Ridley starts by noting observable differences, like men often being better at certain spatial tasks, which correlates with polygamy in some other species, like voles.
Right, he uses the voles as an example where polygynous male voles, who need to navigate large territories to find multiple females, have better spatial skills and larger hippocampi, a brain region involved in spatial memory, than monogamous male voles or females of either type. It sets the stage for exploring potential evolved mental differences between human sexes.
But he immediately acknowledges the controversy. He says stating men and women have different bodies adapted for different roles, child rearing gathering versus hierarchy fighting hunting, is seen as obvious, almost banal.
Yeah, nobody really disputes the physical differences, on average.
But suggesting they have different minds, on average, is often considered inflammatory.
It definitely is. And Ridley is careful here. He stresses that the overlap between sexes is huge, that variation within each sex is usually greater than the average difference between the sexes, and that a lot of folklore about mental differences is just plain sexism.
However,
However, he argues that ignoring the evidence for some average mental differences, just because the topic is sensitive, is scientifically dishonest. He insists that assuming total mental identity between the sexes, despite evidence to the contrary, is just as unfair and potentially harmful as assuming differences without evidence.
so what are the key average mental differences he highlights based on psychological testing?
He focuses on 4 areas where differences consistently show up, on average. First, verbal tasks. Girls and women tend to perform better. Second, mathematical tasks. Boys and men tend to excel, particularly in mathematical reasoning, though computation might be closer.
Boys and men are, on average, more physically aggressive. And fourth, visuospatial tasks. This is mixed. Boys and men often excel at things like map reading, maze learning, or mentally rotating objects. Girls, women might be better at other spatial tasks, like remembering the location of objects or certain types of perceptual speed tasks, and potentially social spatial skills like reading character or mood from faces.
He connects this to common stereotypes, like the cliché about men refusing to ask for directions.
Yeah, he suggests that cliché might reflect something real. Perhaps a stronger male drive to maintain status, not wanting to admit defeat or ignorance, versus a female tendency to rely more on social interaction and local landmarks for navigation. It's speculative, but connects to observed average differences.
But critically, he argues this isn't a simple nature versus nurture debate, right? He brings in the Baldwin effect.
Absolutely. He dismisses the old dichotomy as false. It's not nature or our nurture, it's nurture via nurture. Our genes don't rigidly determine our behavior, they predispose us to learn certain things more easily than others. This is the Baldwin effect. An evolved predisposition to learn shapes what culture then reinforces.
Can you give an example?
Think about social skills. He suggests women's aptitude for social intuition, building alliances, subtly influencing men, judging potential mates, advancing their children's interests likely has deep evolutionary roots in the Pleistocene, where navigating complex social networks was crucial for female reproductive success. Culture then builds upon and refines these innate tendencies.
So nurture reinforces nature.
Usually, yes. He argues nurture rarely fights nature effectively in the long run. Our preferences and abilities, like whether we enjoy reading maps or reading novels, get reinforced by our experiences and cultural expectations. But the underlying aptitude or predisposition to develop those skills easily often has a genetic component. He points again to aggression statistics. The fact that males commit the vast majority of violent crimes and are involved in vastly more drunk driving accidents suggests more than just social conditioning is at play.
So how do these differences actually arise biologically? Hormones seem to be the key mechanism.
Hormones are crucial. It wouldn't work well evolutionarily if genes for, say, spatial skills affected sons and daughters identically when the selection pressures might be different. Instead, genes evolved to be sensitive to the hormonal environment, primarily the presence or absence of androgens like testosterone during critical developmental periods.
Testosterone is the main masculinizer.
Generally, yes. The default developmental pathway for the brain appears to be female. Exposure to sufficient testosterone, particularly during prenatal development, masculinizes certain brain structures and pathways. This isn't just humans, it's seen across species. Even in birds with reverse sex roles or female-dominant hyenas, testosterone levels correlate with typical male-female behaviors, regardless of which sex displays them.
And in humans, we see effects from variations in hormone exposure.
Yes, there's evidence from various conditions. Women with Turner syndrome who produce very little testosterone often show exaggeratedly feminine traits in terms of personality and cognitive profile. Historical accounts of eunuchs suggest they displayed more feminine attitudes. Conversely, girls exposed to unusually high levels of androgens in the womb, GARUG, due to congenital adrenal hyperplasia or mothers receiving certain hormones, often exhibit more tomboyish behavior, higher activity levels, preference for male playmates and toys, sometimes better spatial skills.
Ridley talks about two key pulses of testosterone.
Right. The first, and perhaps most critical for the mind, happens in the womb, starting around 6 weeks after conception. He likens this to exposing the photographic negative. It primes or organizes the brain in a male or female direction. The second major pulse occurs at puberty, which develops the picture, activating those pre-organized circuits and leading to adult sex differences in behavior and motivation.
And the mind and body can be masculinized differently.
That's a key point. The body gets masculinized by the testosterone surge at puberty pretty much regardless of prenatal exposure. But the mind seems to be masculinized primarily by that earlier prenatal exposure. This raises fascinating, if slightly unnerving, possibilities like hypothetically being able to create individuals with male bodies but female typical brains, or vice versa, by manipulating prenatal hormones.
And these mental differences, shaped by hormones, manifest very early, even from birth. The sugar and spice idea.
The evidence suggests yes. That prenatal hormone wash seems to create subtle differences observable almost immediately. Studies suggest baby girls tend to be more interested in looking at faces, while baby boys are more interested in looking at mobiles or objects in motion.
And toy preferences, are they just learned?
Ridley argues, based on the evidence, that toy preferences largely reinforce innate biases rather than create them. Parents often observe sons spontaneously turning sticks into guns or cars, while daughters might cuddle inanimate objects. Giving a boy a doll doesn't usually stop him from treating it like an object to be dismantled, and vice versa. These stereotypical obsessions seem to emerge very early.
This might also explain some differences in school performance.
Potentially. Boys, on average, tend to be more fidgety, have shorter attention spans in classroom settings, and are diagnosed more often with conditions like hyperactivity and dyslexia. Ridley quotes psychologist Diane McGinnis, who provocatively suggested that traditional education systems are often structured in ways that favor typical female aptitudes, like verbal skills and sustained attention, and might be almost a conspiracy against the aptitudes and inclinations of the average schoolboy.
And there are actual structural differences in male and female brains, on average.
Yes, research consistently finds average structural differences. For example, brain functions tend to be more localized or specialized in specific areas in male brains, whereas they're often more diffusely distributed across both hemispheres in female brains. The corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, tends to be proportionally larger in females, possibly facilitating better communication between hemispheres. Language functions, for instance, are often strongly lateralized to the left hemisphere in men, but distributed more bilaterally in women. These structural differences likely underpin some of the functional differences observed.
But the brain remains plastic. He mentions that Dominican Republic case.
Right. The fascinating cases of individuals with 5-alpha reductase deficiency. These are genetic males, XY, born with ambiguous or female-looking genitalia due to an inability to convert testosterone to a more potent form needed for external genital development. They are often raised as girls. However, at puberty, the surge of testosterone causes masculinization, deepening voice, muscle growth, etc. Remarkably, most of these individuals then spontaneously adopt a male gender identity and male typical roles despite being raised female. This suggests the brain retains significant plasticity regarding gender identity up until puberty, and that the pubertal hormone surge plays a powerful role in activating latent predispositions.
Yet, despite this complexity and plasticity, attempts to completely eliminate sex roles culturally often seem to fail. The kibbutz experiment is a striking example.
It is. The Israeli kibbutzim were founded on strong egalitarian principles, actively trying to eliminate traditional sex roles in work and childcare. But studies found that after several generations, despite these ideological efforts, the kibbutzim actually became more sex-typed in some ways than the surrounding Israeli society. Women gravitated back towards more traditional roles in childcare and service industries, often complaining the men didn't do those jobs properly, while men dominated agriculture and politics.
So even in societies striving for equality, occupational segregation persists.
It does seem to persist, even in the most egalitarian Nordic countries. While outright prejudice certainly plays a role, Ridley suggests it's not the only factor. Part of it might be that job roles themselves get subtly molded over time to suit the different average personalities, interests, and aptitudes of men and women, leading to voluntary segregation to some extent.
Finally, he touches on homosexuality again, viewing it as a potential window into brain development.
Yes, moving beyond discredited upbringing theories, research increasingly points towards biological factors, particularly prenatal hormone environment influencing sexual orientation. Gunter Derner's early research, later supported by others, suggested a link between reduced prenatal testosterone exposure, or altered sensitivity, and the likelihood of male homosexuality.
Are there specific correlations?
Studies have found correlations between male homosexuality and certain female typical traits or developmental patterns, such as specific responses to hormones like LH, sometimes slightly different performance on spatial tasks, and even higher rates of left-handedness, which can be linked to prenatal stress or hormonal variations. Stress experienced by the mother during critical periods of pregnancy has also been tentatively linked. It's still complex and not fully understood. The exact interplay between genes, hormones, brain development, and sexual orientation is, as Ridley says, sketchy, but it strongly suggests deep biological roots originating early in development.
Okay, building on the biology of mind and orientation, let's tackle Chapter 9, the uses of beauty. Ridley starts by revisiting the gay gene paradox. We know there's evidence for a genetic component to homosexuality, but how could such genes persist if gay men, on average, have fewer children?
It's a classic evolutionary puzzle. The twin studies strongly suggest heritability. Identical twins have about a 50% concordance rate for homosexuality, much higher than fraternal twins at around 25%. And some evidence points to inheritance through the maternal line.
So how does it survive selection?
Two main hypotheses get discussed. Hypothesis 1, the gene might have a beneficial effect in female relatives. Perhaps the same gene that predisposes a man to be gay increases the fertility or reproductive success of his sisters or mother. This sexually antagonistic selection could maintain the gene in the population.
Okay, makes sense. Hypothesis 2.
Hypothesis 2, proposed by Lawrence Hurst and David Haig, is more speculative. It involves genes in the mitochondria, which, remember, are only inherited from the mother. They suggest that a male-killing or male-harming mitochondrial gene could potentially spread if it sufficiently boosted female reproduction, even if it reduced male fertility, like causing homosexuality. It's a complex idea rooted in that intragenomic conflict we discussed earlier.
What's the takeaway message from this?
Ridley uses it to make a broader point. Understanding the biological basis of traits like sexual orientation doesn't make them worse or more evil than nurture-based explanations. In fact, historically, purely psychological theories led to harmful practices like aversion therapy. Recognizing potential biological roots, even complex ones, promotes a more accurate and often more humane understanding. It reinforces his theme that our preferences, including sexual ones, are likely adaptive in some way, bearing the imprint of design from evolution.
So moving to beauty itself,
Mhm.
is it purely subjective in the eye of the beholder, or are there universal standards? Fashion changes constantly.
Right, fashion is notoriously fickle. Ridley contrasts Rubens' preference for plump figures with the ultra-thin ideal represented by someone like Twiggy. Clearly, cultural standards shift. But, he argues, beneath the surface fluctuations of fashion, some preferences seem remarkably universal and stable across cultures and time. We universally prefer youth over obvious old age. Nobody finds deep wrinkles or gray hair inherently attractive. We generally dislike paunches. Tall men are widely preferred, strong chins in men, smooth skin in women. These aren't things that drift in and out of fashion the same way skirt lengths do. He uses the example of the 3,300-year-old bust of Nefertiti. Her features are still considered beautiful today, suggesting some timeless aesthetic criteria.
This relates to his discussion of incest taboos, contrasting Freud's view with Westermarck's.
Yes, it's about innate preferences versus learned rules. Freud believed we have a secret innate desire for incest, the Oedipus complex, which society then represses with strong taboos.
But Ridley critiques Freud's view.
Heavily. He argues Freud made unjustified assumptions, like equating parental love with sexual attraction and invoking unfalsifiable concepts like repression. Freud also misinterpreted anthropological data, often confusing rules about cousin marriage with taboos against nuclear family incest.
So what was Westermarck's alternative view?
Edward Westermarck proposed back in 1891 something much simpler and more biologically plausible. People develop a natural sexual aversion to those they are intimately reared with during early childhood, typically siblings and parents. This Westermarck Affect is an instinctive mechanism, not something taught by overt taboos, that effectively prevents inbreeding within the close family.
Is there evidence for this?
Yes, quite a bit. Studies of unrelated children raised together from infancy in Israeli kibbutzim show they almost never marry each other, despite no formal prohibition. Conversely, siblings separated at birth and reunited as adults sometimes experience strong sexual attraction, a phenomenon called genetic sexual attraction, precisely because they missed that critical period of developing the aversion. Also, when incest does occur, it's statistically more likely between father and daughter, where the father wasn't reared with the daughter during his critical developmental period for forming the aversion.
So incest avoidance is another great example of nature and nurture working together.
Exactly. The aversion itself is socially induced by the context of being reared together, nurture, but the tendency to develop that aversion during childhood seems to be an innate, evolved predisposition. Nature. It's like language learning, we have an instinct to learn, but what we learn depends on our environment. Ridley calls it critical period learning, where strong, lasting preferences and aversions are formed early in life based on experience guided by underlying instincts.
Okay, let's talk specific features. What about the male preference for thinness in women? Ridley notes it seems widespread in Western culture, but can actually be maladaptive biologically speaking.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle. Extreme thinness below about 10–15% body fat often leads to infertility. So why the obsession? One speculative idea he mentions is that it could be a perhaps unconscious female strategy to delay pregnancy early in a relationship.
But there's a more compelling explanation based on body shape.
Yes, research by Devendra Singh on the waist-to-hip ratio, WHR, seems much more robust. Singh found that men across cultures consistently rate female figures with a low WHR, typically around zero point 0.7 in hourglass shape, as most attractive and healthy, regardless of overall weight.
So it's the ratio, not just being thin.
It's the ratio that seems key. Whether looking at Playboy centerfolds over decades or ancient sculptures, this preferred ratio holds surprisingly constant. Biologically, a low WHR is a strong indicator of youth, health, and crucially, fertility. It signals the presence of estrogen and the absence of pregnancy or certain health conditions. This specific shape typically appears around puberty and fades after menopause, suggesting it's a sexually selected signal of reproductive potential that men have evolved to find attractive. Men are, as Ridley puts it, unconsciously acting as selective breeders for this trait.
What about other specific traits, like blonde hair? Is there an evolutionary reason for that preference, common in Europe?
It's harder to pin down. Blonde hair certainly seems to have been considered attractive historically in Europe, ancient Rome, Renaissance Italy. One explanation could be simple Fisherian runaway selection. If, for whatever reason, a preference for blonde hair arose, men preferring blondes would have blonde daughters, who might then be preferred by the next generation, leading to the trait and the preference spreading together.
Or maybe it's just linked to youth.
That's another possibility, as hair often darkens with age, though the widespread use of hair dye complicates interpreting it purely as an age signal today.
And the idea that average faces are often considered most beautiful.
Yeah, studies using computer-generated composite faces have found that people tend to rate faces created by averaging many individual faces together as more attractive than most of the original individual faces.
Why would average be attractive?
It might signal developmental stability, a lack of genetic mutations, or environmental insults during growth. Or, as Ridley suggests, it could be related to a sexy daughter effect again. If beauty influences social mobility or mate choice, a man choosing a mate with relatively average, non-extreme features might produce daughters who are more broadly appealing and thus more likely to marry well. Since looks are inherited from both parents, women might also prefer regular, average features in men for similar reasons.
Okay, shifting to what women find attractive in men, it's clearly not just about looks, right? Status seems huge.
Absolutely paramount, according to the research Ridley summarizes. While there might be one physical exception, height, tall men are almost universally preferred by women, and height often correlates with status anyway. Women consistently prioritize factors like a man's financial prospects, ambition, social status, and dominance far more heavily than men prioritize these things in women.
Is there evidence for this link between status and mating success?
Yes, across many cultures and studies, married men tend to earn more than single men. In traditional societies, male handsomeness is often explicitly linked to skills, hunting prowess, or leadership ability. Studies even show that women with high earning potential themselves value earning capacity even more in a potential spouse, not less, which counters simple economic explanations.
So expensive cars, watches, designer clothes, these are basically modern-day mating signals.
Blatant signals of rank and resources, Ridley argues. He cites Bobby Lowe's cross-cultural work showing that male ornaments and displays almost universally relate to status, rank, or war prowess, while female ornaments more often relate to marital status or signaling the wealth of their husband or family.
This leads to what Ridley calls the fashion paradox. Women seem much more driven by fashion trends, yet they're arguably trying to impress men, who often seem less concerned with those specific status symbols than women.
It is a bit paradoxical. Women are demonstrably more influenced by fashion, its novelty, its conformity, its sometimes biologically punishing standards, like foot binding or corsets historically. Yet the conventional wisdom is they do this primarily to attract men, who often profess to care little about specific brands or trends, focusing more on underlying physical attractiveness.
Though men haven't always dressed plainly.
No, Ridley points out that historically, men often wore incredibly bright colors, jewels, elaborate wigs, and fancy clothing. Think Renaissance courtiers or 18th century aristocrats. The drab Victorian suit was a relatively recent and perhaps temporary aberration. He also mentions studies showing both sexes often misestimate what the other finds most attractive. Men tend to overestimate the muscularity women prefer, while women overestimate the thinness men prefer.
So, in a generally monogamous species like humans, beauty has to stand out.
Yes, because mating is a high-stakes, long-term investment, especially for men choosing a primary partner. Men are discriminating precisely because they typically invest heavily in relatively few women compared to highly polygynous species. Beauty, therefore, needs to be noticeable and signal quality effectively.
This all feeds back into that Red Queen idea of folly of sexual perfectionism, constantly raising the bar.
Exactly. If the most beautiful women consistently pair with the most dominant, wealthy men, and they have slightly more or healthier offspring, then the average standards of both beauty and dominance should theoretically rise over generations. We're all forced to run faster just to stay in the same place on this evolutionary treadmill of mate selection. We instinctively gauge our own desirability based on how others react to us, constantly adjusting our expectations and efforts. This relentless self-assessment, Ridley suggests, is part and parcel of the Red Queen's race in the realm of sexual selection.
Okay, we've covered sex, gender conflicts, beauty, mating strategies. Now the final big piece, human intelligence. Chapter 10, The Intellectual Chess Game, tackles the huge puzzle of our enormous brains. Ridley starts with that cynical Rochester poem questioning human reason.
Reason, an ignis fatuus of the mind. Yeah, it sets the skeptical tone. And then he uses that clever analogy of a dolphin conference.
Right, the dolphins debating why their brains are so big. Was it for complex language? Or maybe for scheming and manipulating each other within their own social groups?
Oh, it's a great way to frame the question for humans, too. Our brain is a biological anomaly. It's 3 times larger than expected for a primate of our size, and it's incredibly energy hungry, consuming maybe 18–20% of our total daily energy budget.
Just the brain. Why?
Just the brain. Yet we don't reproduce noticeably faster or more prolifically than many species with much smaller brains. So what enormous evolutionary advantage justified this massive metabolic cost? That's the central mystery.
And Ridley argues that many traditional explanations for our intelligence fall short, calling them humanist sophistry. What does he mean?
He critiques the tendency, particularly in older anthropology and psychology, to overemphasize human uniqueness and downplay cognitive abilities in other animals. Attributing things like tool use, grammar, or empathy only to humans often ignored growing evidence of similar, if simpler, capacities elsewhere.
He also challenges the old learning versus instinct idea.
Yes, the idea that learning, being plastic, is somehow the opposite of instinct, being prepared or innate, is a false dichotomy, he argues. Humans are arguably the most flexible learners on the planet, and we also have arguably the largest suite of complex instincts. The two go together.
Language acquisition is the prime example.
It's the perfect example. Noam Chomsky's revolutionary idea of a deep structure, or universal grammar, suggested that the fundamental rules of grammar aren't learned from scratch but are largely innate, generated by a kind of language organ in the brain. We don't learn that we should use nouns and verbs. We have an instinct to acquire language using those categories based on the input we receive.
So nature isn't the opposite of nurture here.
Not at all. Our ability to use language is clearly genetic in the sense that we have this innate acquisition device, but it's also entirely cultural in that we learn the specific vocabulary and syntax of the language spoken around us. This completely demolishes the old nature-nurture separation. Research in AI and cognitive science further showed that brains aren't blank slates. They must come equipped with specialized innate mechanisms or mental programs for handling complex tasks like language, recognizing faces, reading emotions, and making social inferences.
If instincts are so efficient, why did we evolve such a capacity for learning? Why not just have instincts for everything?
That's a great question. If learning simply replaced instincts, we'd be incredibly inefficient, having to relearn basic survival skills every generation. Nature generally equips animals with highly efficient instincts for predictable tasks, like a bat's sonar or a cuckoo's migration route. Humans, Ridley argues, evolved instincts to learn specifically those things that are too complex or too variable across environments to be hardwired, like language, social customs, or tool-making techniques. Learning allows adaptation to unpredictable challenges.
So if those are the general principles, what about specific theories for why human intelligence exploded? He debunks some common materialist ones, like the toolmaker myth.
Right. Kenneth Oakley famously argued man the toolmaker was the defining characteristic driving our evolution. But as Ridley points out, chimpanzees and even other animals make and use tools, and the archaeological record is heavily biased towards durable stone tools. Maybe less tangible things like complex language or sophisticated social structures were actually more significant drivers much earlier than the tool record suggests.
What about man the hunter or woman the gatherer?
These emphasize the cognitive demands of finding food. But again, lions hunt cooperatively and baboons have complex foraging knowledge, all with much smaller brains relative to body size. These ecological challenges don't seem sufficient on their own to explain the evolution of abilities like abstract thought, philosophy, art, or complex recursive grammar.
He also dismisses the neutral theory, or Stephen Jay Gould's neoteny idea.
Yes, given the huge energy cost, the brain simply cannot be a neutral trait that just drifted into existence, or a purely accidental byproduct of something else. Gould's neoteny idea suggests humans retain juvenile ape features, like a large brain case relative to the jaw, less body hair, into adulthood due to slowed development, and maybe our big brains are just part of that package.
But Ridley argues against that.
While humans clearly are neotenic in some respects, the sheer cost of the brain demands an active, powerful, selective advantage driving its expansion, not just a passive consequence of delayed development. Truly neotenic animals, like domestic dogs compared to wolves, usually mature faster sexually, not slower like humans. The brain needs a better reason for being.
So if it wasn't tools or hunting or a developmental accident, what was the driving force? This leads us to the core idea of the chapter, the Machiavellian hypothesis.
This is the theory, championed by scientists like Richard Alexander and Nicholas Humphrey, that the primary hostile force of nature shaping human intelligence wasn't the physical environment, but other humans.
Our own species.
Exactly. Dealing with predictable challenges like finding tubers or avoiding predators is one thing, but interacting constantly with other individuals who have minds of roughly equal complexity, whose motives might be cooperative one minute and deceptive or competitive the next, that presents a uniquely challenging, constantly escalating cognitive arms race.
A social chess game.
A high-stakes social chess game. You need to be able to predict others' behavior, detect cheating, manipulate social situations, form alliances, maintain reputation, deceive when necessary, and see through others' deception. This constant pressure to outsmart rivals and collaborators within your own species, Alexander and Humphrey argued, is the most plausible engine for the runaway evolution of human intelligence.
And Ridley sees evidence for this in our everyday obsessions.
Yes. Think about our fascination with gossip, social intrigue, who's doing what with whom. It dominates news, literature, soap operas. He argues this isn't trivial. It reflects the deep importance our minds place on tracking social information, understanding motives, and navigating complex relationships. This is our Machiavellian intelligence at work.
It links back to that Dawkins and Krebs idea of communication being manipulation.
Precisely. If social life is a complex game of cooperation and conflict, then communication, especially language, becomes a primary tool for persuading, manipulating, deceiving, and forming alliances. And the Watson selection task experiments by Cosmides and Gigerenzer provide strong support.
The cheater detection task.
Right. People are surprisingly bad at solving abstract logical versions of the task, but remarkably good at solving it when it's framed as a social contract, where they need to detect someone who is cheating, like catching underage drinkers. This suggests our reasoning abilities are specifically tuned for social exchange and detecting violations of social rules, a mistrustful Machiavellian mind, as Ridley puts it. We see hints of this in other primates too, like baboons deceiving their mothers or the complex political maneuvering observed by Franz de Waal in chimpanzees.
But if other apes also have complex social lives and show Machiavellian intelligence, why did human intelligence take off so dramatically? The general need for social smarts doesn't seem quite specific enough.
That's the lingering question. And this is where Ridley introduces what he considers the last best hope for explaining our unique cognitive explosion. Geoffrey Miller's theory of intelligence as a product of sexual selection.
So back to the neurological peacock's tail. Our intelligence, wit, creativity, language skills, these evolved primarily as courtship displays.
That's Miller's provocative thesis. He argues that these traits, which are often hard to justify based on purely survival benefits, make perfect sense as elaborate, costly signals used to attract mates. Just as the peacock's tail signals genetic quality, perhaps a large vocabulary, quick wit, artistic creativity, or musical ability, evolved as indicators of underlying brain quality, genetic fitness, and good parenting potential.
He calls it the Scheherazade effect and the Dionysus effect.
Right. The Scheherazade effect posits that females might have evolved greater verbal creativity and novelty to keep easily bored males interested and invested long enough to provide paternal care, like Scheherazade telling stories to save her life. The Dionysus effect suggests males evolved capacities for wit, humor, music, and storytelling primarily as tools for seducing females. Think of the appeal of rock stars or charismatic leaders, the Mick Jagger effect. Tribal chiefs are often noted for being both gifted orators and highly polygamous.
So our standards for what we find witty or entertaining just kept evolving alongside our intelligence.
Exactly. As brains got bigger and more capable, the threshold for what counted as an impressive mental display kept rising, driving further selection for even greater intelligence and a classic runaway process, fueled by mate choice.
But doesn't this theory seem a bit circular? Choosiness leads to intelligence, which leads to more choosiness.
It definitely has a circular element, much like Fisher's original theory of runaway sexual selection for physical traits. Miller acknowledges this. Choosiness, perhaps initially for reliable providers, leads to selection for traits indicating reliability or intelligence, which requires bigger brains, which take longer to develop, requiring more parental care, which reinforces the need for choosiness.
But is that circularity a flaw, or just how evolution works?
Ridley, echoing Miller, argues it's the latter. Evolution often works via these positive feedback loops. It pulls itself up by its bootstraps. Effects reinforce causes, leading to accelerating, sometimes seemingly explosive change. There isn't always a single linear cause. It's often a dynamic, self-reinforcing system.
So the grand conclusion is that our enormous, costly brains are the ultimate, perhaps unintended consequence of this relentless sexual arms race.
That's the powerful synthesis Ridley presents. Sex evolved primarily to help us fight disease by shuffling our genes. But the choosiness that sex enables the ability of individuals to select mates based on indicators of quality then took on a life of its own, driving the evolution of elaborate displays, including the most elaborate display of all, the human mind.
It's a disquieting but liberating perspective, he says.
It is. It removes the need for some grand external purpose for our intelligence. Instead, it suggests our very drives for wit, creativity, virtuosity, inventiveness, the things that make us uniquely human, evolved because they historically made us attractive to each other. It's an evolutionary imperative to be interesting, to be different.
So after that whirlwind tour through sex, genes, beauty, and brains, Ridley concludes with a brief epilogue that brings us back down to earth, the self-domesticated ape. He emphasizes how young the scientific study of human nature really is.
Yeah, it's a humbling perspective. He compares our current understanding to mapping the world in ancient times. We have some detailed charts of small areas, rough outlines of continents, but vast areas are still marked, "Here be dragons." There are still huge surprises and likely many errors in our current maps of human nature. He urges us to move beyond those sterile nature-nurture debates to really fill in the blanks.
And he stresses the importance of that comparative perspective, looking at other animals.
Absolutely. He argues it's impossible to truly understand why any animal is the way it is, why a phalarope has reverse sex roles, why a sage grouse leks, why an elephant seal fights for harems, why a chimpanzee engages in politics without looking at its evolutionary history, its specific ecological pressures, its parental investment patterns, its diet, its ancestry. We can't understand ourselves in isolation either. We need to compare ourselves to other species, rejecting that knee-jerk human exceptionalism or hubris, to understand the forces that shaped us.
And his final thought is that civilization itself is a kind of self-domestication.
That's the evocative phrase he uses. We have undoubtedly been shaped profoundly by culture, and civilization has perhaps selected against some of our more extreme Pleistocene instincts, domesticating us to a degree.
But the core instincts remain.
The fundamental evolved instincts remain powerful. He points to examples like the experimental commune Rajneeshpuram in Oregon, which attempted to create a society free from traditional constraints. Predictably, perhaps, hierarchies, status competition, and possessive sexual relationships quickly reemerged. Our core nature, shaped by millions of years of evolution under the Red Queen's gaze, is deeply persistent, even under layers of cultural veneer. ### outro.
Wow, what an absolutely incredible journey we've been on today, diving deep into Matt Ridley's The Red Queen. We've seen how this relentless, never-ending evolutionary battle, driven largely by sex and parasites, has profoundly shaped pretty much everything about us: our genes, our bodies, our minds, the way we form relationships, even things we cherish like beauty and intelligence.
It's really quite staggering when you lay it all out. From the fundamental mystery of why sex even exists, given its costs, through the intricate genetic conflicts playing out within us, the evolution of gender, the extraordinary lengths animals go to for courtship and beauty, right up to the ultimate evolutionary chess game that might have produced our own complex intellect. The Red Queen's race is always, always on.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that every facet of human nature, however complex or culturally mediated it seems, is deeply rooted in our evolutionary past. We're constantly adapting, constantly striving, even if unconsciously, in this ongoing race.
Absolutely, constantly shaped by those ancient pressures.
So what's the final takeaway for you listening right now? Maybe it's this. In a world that often pushes us towards conformity, towards being average, perhaps the most fundamentally evolutionary and maybe the most truly human thing you could do is to embrace your own uniqueness, your wit, your creativity, your individuality.
Because, as Ridley's thesis suggests, it's precisely those qualities, the things that make you stand out, that make you interesting, that have historically turned other people on, and, in the grand evolutionary scheme, driven the astonishing development of our minds. So maybe the message is, be different.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration of the Red Queen sparks your own curiosity to look deeper into the fascinating, complex, and often surprising evolutionary forces that have made us who we are.